All right, we are live. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to week 4 of Mere Christianity. Um, so, I want to start things off today by first of all saying thank you very much for joining us here this evening. And we've reached the halfway point where we've kind of done the uphill slope, and now we're on the downhill slope. Um, I do want to apologize because it's funny, and I hope everybody can hear me and see me and everything okay this week because I noticed after last week, I went back and watched last week's feed, and I realized that I made a mistake and a technical mistake. And this, so far, every single week we've done this, I've had at least some technical problem or another. If you remember, for those of you that were this in week 1, the webcam that I had up here, which is a higher quality camera than what I have on the computer, and the microphone I have next to me, neither one was working. And so we ended up having to just do it through the webcam on the computer and the microphone. And then the second week, I got the camera to work, but the mic wasn't working. And then the third week, last week, I thought everything was hunky dory because I had both the camera working and the microphone working. But then when I went back and watched the feed, I realized that even though I have the computer that I'm streaming this through actually is hardwired to the internet, it won't switch to that if it was already on Wi-Fi to begin with. If it was accessing the internet wirelessly, you actually have to turn the wireless connection off in order for it to switch to the wired connection. And I didn't do that. And so I was streaming the entire last week's class through my Wi-Fi connection, which is much slower. And so I could notice there were frames dropped. It was kind of a choppy video. Audio seemed to be fine, but the video was kind of choppy. So I apologize for that. This week, I hopefully have everything working. The camera should be working, the microphone should be working, and we're hardwired to the internet. So hopefully we'll have a better connection. So we'll see. If not, I got 2 more weeks to get it all right, right? Um, so anyway, thank you everybody for joining us today. I do want to start things out by just mentioning, I don't know how many people followed him or not, obviously, as a Christian apologist. Ravi Zacharias was one of the #1 influences that kind of brought me to where I am. Those of you that might have heard my story, I was a very typical story where I kind of grew up in the church, but then I fell away in my college years. And then I went to law school. And of course, in law school, what do you get taught? You get taught to, cross-examine everything, to question everything, to investigate everything. And there aren't a lot of Christians in law school, to be honest with you. And so part of my initial reaction coming out of law school was, well, if I'm supposed to cross-examine everything, then I'm going to cross-examine this whole Christianity thing. Again, I never completely fell away from my faith, but I definitely, God kept sending me little reminders, but I definitely was not practicing it like I should have been. And as I came out of law school, and that's where I kind of started down this apologetics journey over 2 decades ago. And one of the first people the first Christian apologist that I really started getting into was Ravi Zacharias. And to show you, I've got the younger people in the crowd will appreciate this one. I've got my truck, which I still have to this day. I've got a 2004 Ford Explorer sport truck. So my truck is 16 years old. And to show you how long I've been into Ravi Zacharias, on my truck, if you look at the radio on my truck, it advertises right on there that it plays MP3s. And so you're thinking, oh, great, like I had an MP3 player on my truck. You just have, you plug your cord into your phone, you plug the other cord end into the radio, and you can play things through your phone, right through your car speakers, right? Oh, not so fast. This truck is so old that what it means by, if those of you remember when we first started to be able to burn our own CDs, some CD players were capable of playing the CDs that you would make yourself, and some weren't. And that MP3 advertisement on my truck stereo system was advertising that it was capable of playing those types of CDs that we could burn ourselves and put MP3s onto. And so that's what I did is I actually downloaded a whole bunch of Ravi Zacharias's shows, sermons, lectures, and I would burn them onto CD. And I had the 6 CD changer in my truck, still got the same truck. And I would just put them all in there. I'd fill all 6 CD spots with his lectures. And I would just, whenever I was driving or going anywhere, I would always, be listening to him. I'm not going to go too much into that now, other than to say, for those that didn't hear, he did pass away from cancer on yesterday morning. And so we are actually on Friday at noon. I've mentioned here before in this class that I do host a a weekly apologetics program Fridays at noon here on the channel, Pocket-Sized Apologetics. We're going to do something a little different this week. If anybody was ever influenced or you're a fan of Ravi Zacharias, I've got some friends of mine, some other Christian apologist acquaintances of mine, are going to come on the show, kind of much like we're doing this right now, except you'll be able to see them through a Zoom meeting. And we're going to actually spend a Devote Fridays program to doing a tribute to Ravi Zacharias. So if anybody is interested in that, you want to join in the conversation there and you know, put in the live chat. If you have memories of him at all, ways he's influenced you, you want to join us, that's going to be Friday at 12 noon for probably about 30, 45 minutes. So, okay, so moving on to what we're all here for, which is Mere Christianity. Give me a second here to open up the slideshow. And oh, look, my phone is telling me that there's a Mere Christianity class live streaming on the Trinity Joppa YouTube channel right now that it wants me to watch. I think I will. All right. Close that out. There we go. I think I mentioned last week that the way Zoom works, it's weird. It makes me actually, if an app is open at the time I start the Zoom meeting, it won't let me share it. But so I had to reopen it again. Here we go. All right. So, Mere Christianity. We're on book 4. Or no, that's not right. We're on week 4. It's book 3. I should have that title slide is wrong. We're still in book 3. I apologize for that. But it's called Christian Behavior. And last week we tried to get through, you know, the first 6 chapters of that book, and we only got through the first 5. So we're going to pick up where we left off last week with book 6 and try to see if we can get, or chapter 6, and see if we can get through the end of the book, chapter 12. Let's move on. The topic of chapter 6, we talked about, you know, human sexuality basically in chapter 5, and then Lewis moves into the Christian idea of marriage. All right. And what he says here, and he defines it, he says the Christian idea of marriage is based on Christ's words that a man and wife are to be regarded as a single organism. For that is what the words one flesh would be in modern English. And then he goes on to try to, you know, what Lewis's goal here is, he's keeping it as mere Christianity, right? And so he says that as a consequence, when he talks about the differences between different Christian denominations, it acknowledges that there are differences when it comes to the matter of divorce between the different Christian denominations, but he tries to find that common core that they all share. And what he says is, as a consequence, Christianity teaches that marriage is for life. The churches all agree with one another about marriage a great deal more than any of them agrees with the outside world. I don't know if Lewis would share that sentiment today, but at least at the time he was writing, that's what he would say. I mean, they all regard divorce as something like cutting up a living body, as a kind of surgical operation. Some of them think the operation is so violent that it cannot be done at all. Others admit it as a desperate remedy in extreme cases. All right, so he's acknowledging here that, you know, there's differences of opinion in Christian denominations about whether or when divorce should be permitted. However, they all say that the ideal is obviously for marriage to stay for life because the two are joined as one. That's the biblical imagery, if you want to call it that, of marriage. But what he really turns his attention to is he tries to talk about the marriage relationship itself and how we should be viewing the marriage relationship itself. And he views it through the lens of the virtue of justice. Now, you may remember last week, Lewis talked a little bit about the cardinal virtues, all right? And he mentioned 4 cardinal virtues: prudence, temperance, justice, and fortitude. He didn't spend a whole lot of time talking about justice, but what he defined it as the old name for everything we should now call fairness. It includes honesty, give and take, truthfulness, keeping promises, and all that side of life. And so what he does here when he's talking about marriage is he revisits that idea of justice and says that the way we should look at marriage through the lens of justice. The key aspect of marriage, according to Lewis, is the promise that the husband and wife are making to each other to stay committed to each other. If you make this promise and you don't intend to keep it, and this is where he's getting into, again, those denominational differences. You know, he's not talking about certain denominations allow it, other ones don't.
Oh, hold on.
Hey, Gene, I think your mic is on.
Uh, oh gosh. Okay, hold on.
That's okay.
Mute, right? Okay.
Good. All right. So what he's talking about here is he's talking about the fact that when you're entering into the marriage relationship, what should you be thinking about? We could maybe use some of this for premarital counseling. He says he wants people to look at it through the eyes of justice. When you're making that promise, at the time you make it, you should intend to keep it. All right. And I think his suggestion is that too many people maybe take marriage too lightly, and even when they're entering into a marriage, they're thinking, well, if it doesn't work out, I can always just get out of it later on. That's not the right mindset going in, is what Lewis is saying here. And he says the intent to keep the promise does not just mean an intention to keep it as long as we keep having these fluttery feelings that often accompany young love. It's a commitment to stay in relationship with each other even as feelings change and develop. A mature love is not the same as young love. And those fluttery feelings, that's actually what Lewis calls, if you read this chapter and you got confused a little bit, it's because Lewis, his terminology is, he's not as precise as maybe as he could be, but when he talks about those fluttery feelings that, what some people call infatuation or early love, young love, he calls that being in love. All right. And he makes a distinction between being in love and love as a broader concept. Being in love is a subset of love as a broader concept, but it's not the be all and end all of love. There are other manifestations of love other than just that early young love, being in love, kind of fluttery feeling thing. And what he says is ceasing to be in love need not mean ceasing to love. Love in this second sense, love as distinct from being in love, is not merely a feeling. It is a deep unity maintained by the will and deliberately strengthened by habit, reinforced by, in Christian marriages, the grace which both partners ask and receive from God. Being in love first moved them to promise fidelity. This quieter love enables them to keep the promise. So what he's saying is here, he's not diminishing young love by any stretch of the imagination. I think some people might misread him to think that. What he's saying is when we first fall in love with someone, it may seem like there's pink unicorns flying all around our heads and all this kind of stuff, okay? And what Lewis is saying is that type of early love is what is going to prompt someone to want to make a lifelong commitment to someone. But the lifelong commitment has to include more than just those fluttery feelings. I mean, anyone who's been in a relationship with a partner will know that you don't always get along with each other. You're not always going to have fluttery feelings and everything's going to be hunky-dory and, just like and they lived happily ever after, like you see in the fairy tales. All right, there's going to be times are going to be tough. And what he's saying is if all we do is we equate the be all and end all of love with being those fluttery feelings, that early young love, then we're going to be in for a shock when that first fight happens, when, things get tough, when things change over time. And what he proposes is that at his time, he says, books and plays and the cinema shape our perception of what love should be like and paint an inaccurate picture of what he describes as being in love as the be all and end all of our relationships. In other words, he says, if you look at the entertainment of his time, he thinks that it creates this idea of what all that love really is. All love, all the time, is always having these wonderful rosebuds and birds chirping in the air type of experiences. All right. And so it creates this false expectation in people's minds, which he thinks contributes then to the false expectations going into marriage. All right. So my first question is to field it out there to people to see. This was obviously something Lewis wrote a long time ago, back in the 1940s. Is it true today? Do you still feel that do you see examples of, well, how do you see love portrayed in entertainment today? Let me field that question. If you were to describe how movies, how TV shows, and this is where I vamp so the YouTube people can catch up. If you were to see how, movies and video and TV shows and things like that, and how do they portray true love, how would you describe it? How do they portray true love? Now I get my drink of water. We're early yet, so I don't have to resort to singing songs and stuff.
And a lot of times, the entertainment industry portrays love as perfect, no problems, no consequences, no struggles. Very few movies that have the divorce element, if you will. But a lot of time, it's a perfect love that everybody thinks that they want. So.
And they lived happily ever after.
Exactly.
Yeah. Thomas Scott here says Hallmark. Look at the Hallmark Channel, right? And Lisa Brown says it's all about feelings. Yeah, and it's funny, isn't it? Bill Rearick says the Hallmark Channel is total fluttery. Isn't it true that I mean that's how love is portrayed, and so that's kind of like that's what we all are shooting for. But if that's what you think love is, and that's what you go into marriage thinking the rest of your life is always going to be like, I got news for you. It ain't. You know, there are going to be disagreements. There are going to be difficult times, and so that's why Lewis is encouraging us to view love and view marriage through the lens of justice, in the sense that, look, do you mean what you say or not? All right, because you made a commitment. All right, and your commitment wasn't to, you know, it wasn't just, oh, I'm going to stick with you as long as I keep feeling this way and having these fluttery feelings. It was in sickness and in health, in good times and in bad. Now, that's not to say that, you know, things don't happen. That's what he said at the beginning. You know, different churches have differences of opinion about, you know, whether divorce should be allowed and when divorce should be allowed. But the point is, going into the marriage, what our mindset should be is we have to have the right mindset. It's not about the feelings, it's about the commitment. Lindsay Lessner says it's not reality. Exactly. What the way, and you know what, and that's true of Hollywood in general, but it's amazing to me. People don't realize how much our entertainment influences us. Nothing's reality. You know, there's not really Captain Americas around that look like Chris Evans and can lift cars and like throw, you know. First of all, Captain America's shield defies all laws of physics, doesn't it? I mean, there's no way she'd be able to fly out there and it would never bounce back to him. So anyway, but that's a side note. But we all, in those types of things, we kind of understand there's a lack of reality. We're suspending our disbelief. But entertainment, especially in whether it be romance or dramas or, you know, crime stories, things like this, these things that aren't so overly fantastical, like your superhero movies, like your science fiction. But even with the science fiction, we allow it to influence us. And it's bugging me because I always forget who said the quote, and now I can't remember. He was a Scottish statesman, I want to say. It's right at the tip of my tongue. But the quote that I love is, "Let me write the songs of a nation. I care not who writes its laws." And the point is, you know, if you really want to influence people, if you really want to change and shift the morals and shift the direction of a society, you don't do that through writing laws banning this, prohibiting that, whatever. You do that through entertainment, because the things we allow to entertain ourselves are what influence us more profoundly than we possibly imagine. I give an example lots of times in classes I teach of Pulp Fiction. It's a movie, a very popular movie, probably longer ago than I want to admit. I never actually saw the whole thing in theaters. I've seen bits and pieces of it since then. But there's a scene in Pulp Fiction where two of the main characters are talking about what you call, I believe it's a Big Mac. All right. And they're talking about, well, in this country, it's called Le Big Mac. And here it's just the Royale with cheese. And what people don't realize is they think this is just a discussion about what the name of a hamburger is, but it folds into the broader themes of the movie as a whole. And what it's talking about is, you know what, there really is no, remember week one, we talked about that objective moral standard that we're all subject to. Pulp Fiction, the whole purpose, the whole theme of that movie is there is no such standard. All right, that we all determine for ourselves what's right and what's wrong. Even a Big Mac, there's no right or wrong answer for what to call a Big Mac. Just like there's no right or wrong answer about whether murder is really right or wrong. I mean, that's the whole point. One of the major points of that movie, one of the major themes of that movie, and people don't realize that they think they're sitting down just getting entertained. They're really getting influenced by a philosophy that's being injected into that. Barbara Gordon says a lot of shows are more negative about love in marriage. You know, Barbara, I'm glad you said that because I'll give you an example. It's a pet peeve of mine as a dad, you know. And there's a stereotypical character, usually on sitcoms, of the bumbling dad, you know, and it kind of bugs the heck out of me where you see this, it's played up for humor. That, you know, the father figure is largely incompetent, always messing things up. You know, the kids are smarter than the dad and things like that. And it kind of annoys me because it's creating this cultural idea out there that does permeate the culture. And as a result, you know, we see the role of, you know, father, strong father figures being diminished. You know, dads are now the butt end of a joke. It's very much negative about a lot of things, and that's one example of it. That's just a personal aside that kind of bugs the heck out of me. But yeah, I agree with you. All right. Lewis then goes on to say that while he thinks divorce should be discouraged, he does not think Christians should vote for divorce to be more difficult because not everyone is Christian or will share Christian values. Now, what I want to talk about here is not so much Lewis's underlying conclusion as much as his rationale for it. His rationale for it is not everybody's Christian, so we should not be forcing our Christian views upon them. All right. First of all, purely from the divorce standpoint, just a couple food for thought things. Number one, are there societal benefits to a more stable institution of marriage? In other words, even if we were to leave out the whole Christian theological basis for marriage, would there be a reason some people might still want to discourage divorce, you know, and not allow people just to get freely divorced anytime they want to? I can see, and there's certainly people that argue that there are societal benefits to a strong institution of marriage. So just because everybody's not Christian doesn't necessarily mean there isn't still a value in trying to promote strong, long-lasting marriages. But the other thing I want to say is this whole idea of, you know, forcing your views on others. We shouldn't force our view on others is actually a pretty philosophically bankrupt position to take, and here's why. It's pretty easily defeated. It's Greg Kokel is a Christian apologist that talks about this a lot, and he gives an example of a time I think it was at the barber shop, and he was talking to his barber, and his barber was not Christian, and was talking to, you know, Greg about, I don't remember how the subject started, what they were talking about, but something that he did at his church or something like that. And the barber says something to the effect of, you know, well, Greg, you guys, you Christians, you do a lot of good work, and I really like that. But then it always comes down where, you know, but then in the end, you always end up trying to force your beliefs on other people. And Greg asked him, or he says, you're trying to force your views on other people. And Greg asked him, well, is that your view? And he says, you shouldn't do that. You know, for guys, the barber says, you shouldn't force your views on other people. So Greg says, well, is that your view? And the barber said, yes. And so Greg Kokel then said, well, why are you trying to force it on me then? And the barber said, oh, no, you're getting me all twisted. And they go back and forth like this for a while. But the idea being that whenever you try to say you should not force your view, or it's wrong for you to force your view on somebody else, the problem is you're violating your own rule, because what you're trying to do is force your view on them that they shouldn't force their views on other people. And so it doesn't work out as a philosophical standpoint. And the other example I give here on the slide, as far as where do we draw the line, is what's called the modified pro-life position. And this is, you don't see this as much nowadays, but you saw it back when, well, I mean, Al Gore was one who advocated for it when he was running for president. Somebody asked him at the time, well, are you pro-life or are you pro-choice? And what he said was, well, I'm personally pro-life, but I don't want to force my views on other people. And so, you know, I believe in the pro-choice position. Well, the problem, and I'm not getting into the abortion debate right now, we can have that later on if we want to, but the point being that view, while it sounds all noble, because, well, I don't want to force my views on others, it's actually contradictory, because the question becomes, well, wait a minute, is the thing in the womb, is that an innocent human being or isn't it? Because if it is, then why would you be willing to allow other people to kill it? But if it isn't, then why are you personally pro-life? You know, you can't have it both ways. And so people use this idea, and I think Lewis kind of does here too, of saying, well, I don't want to force my views on others because it sounds very noble. But when you take these issues and you start kind of getting underneath them and really asking pointed questions, you start to realize that most of the times it's just that. It's a noble platitude that sounds good, but when you start getting into the specifics, it really doesn't hold up. It really doesn't hold up. Lisa Brown here says, welfare hurt the family. When government takes fiscal responsibility for the family, there's no reason to be responsible for your actions. And that's, I mean, I think that's where that the theme of responsibility is what Lewis is hitting on here when he's talking about marriage, and from a perspective of justice. You know, we are talking about, you know, being honest, honoring your commitments, and being responsible for your commitments. All right. Now, Lewis's final point that he talks about in this chapter is a fun one. And that is where he talks about he attempts to explain why husbands are said in scripture to be the head of a Christian marriage. All right. And I think if you read this passage, the reaction that some of you may have to it right off the bat is at least some of his justifications for that do seem to be dated, do seem to be a result of the culture of his time. For example, one of the things he said in there is that, well, a man is more capable of being just to outsiders than a woman is. You know, I don't know if I would necessarily agree with that, Lewis, you know, but on the whole, the question is, what does the Bible say about Christian and the male headship, so to speak? Barbara Gordon says, we are back to free choice. If you choose to be responsible or not, it's your choice. Yes, I agree with you, Barbara. So what you've got on the screen here now is one of the most famous passages about, you know, husbands and wives. And it's Ephesians chapter 5, verses 21 through 28. And I will start out by saying I'm an apologist. I'm not a theologian. There may be other people watching this class tonight that know far more about this than I do. So I'm just going to say my 2 cents for what I know, and then move on. And what it says is this: submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Wives, submit yourselves to your own husbands as you do to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ is the head of the church, his body, of which he is the Savior. Now, as the church submits to Christ, so also wives should submit to their husbands in everything. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her to make her holy, cleansing her by the washing with water through the word, and to present her to himself as a radiant church, without stain or wrinkle or any other blemish, but holy and blameless. In this same way, husbands ought to love their wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. One thing that you should notice right off the bat in reading this passage, even before you start getting into the questions about what does it mean to submit, what does it mean to love, for husbands to love their wives, things like that, is right off the bat it says submit to one another. It's a two-way street. All right. And too many people, I think, when they quote this passage, they'll quote the passage about wives submit to your husbands, but then they'll skip the part of the end that says husbands love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself up for her. How did Christ love the church? Christ died for the church. All right. And so whatever this means, it's a two-way street. The overall passage in context, which is why another thing Greg Kokel loves to say is never read a Bible verse. And by what he means is don't read a verse in isolation. You've always got to read something in its full surrounding context. And this is a prime example of that, where people will love to pick and choose individual things out and not read the overall context. The overall context, well, again, I'm not a theologian, so I'm not getting into overly specifics about it. But the overall context is a two-way street. What Paul is doing here is he's establishing obligations on both sides and saying that both parties in a marriage have obligations to each other. All right. And that's the model and what we need to understand going into a marriage. Thomas Scott says, Lewis is saying you cannot legislate Christian views. It is forcing them by law. Well, yes and no, Tom. I agree with you, because remember that quote I said before that, let me write the songs of a nation. I care not who writes its laws. I agree, but let me ask you this question. Let's say that you have something that's put out there by referendum, And for those of you who aren't familiar with the way the legal system works, referendum is basically where the people themselves vote on whether or not something should become a law. All right. We've had several in Maryland a few years back, where it basically comes up because the legislators at the government level, somebody thinks that maybe this law that would pass if it was kept at the legislature level doesn't stand as good of a chance of passing if the people themselves are voting on it. And so they go through these steps and they get the number of signatures and everything like that. And they put it out there by referendum. So the people themselves are voting. All right. Now let's suppose that you had a referendum that you were required to vote upon that dealt with one of these issues. If we take Lewis's example, it dealt with some divorce law and how permissive divorce should be. And you and your Christian your Christian approach think that whatever this is doing is taking it one step too far. That's making it too easy. Maybe it's not considering something. It's devaluing marriage in some way, shape, or form by not having people make a commitment, understand what the commitment's supposed to be at the beginning. And let's suppose that you think that there are social benefits to it as well. Is Lewis's rationale solely, all he's saying is, look, not everybody's Christian, so we shouldn't be passing these laws to force them to accept the Christian view of divorce. Does that mean that when you are the one that has to cast that ballot and you're the one that has to cast that vote, that you should cast a vote opposite of what your Christian sensibilities are, opposite of what your Christian morality says is the right thing to do, solely because other people aren't Christian? And we can disagree about that, and that's fine. But that's kind of where I come at it from, that I don't think that his justification holds up, because it's not that simple. And also, even if it wasn't a referendum, the fact of the matter is, we're in a republic like we have here in America. In theory, the people we elect are supposed to be representing us. And so in a sense, it is almost like they're casting our vote for us. We're just appointing them to go cast our vote on some issue or another. And so when they vote for something that is contrary to what we think is right, it is in a sense still representing us. Thomas Scott said, consider gambling initiative. I voted no. Yeah, but that's an example of a referendum that went out there. Well, not everybody's Christian. That some people like gambling. Should we have had? I think under the way Lewis expresses his rationale, and I've said a number of times in this class before, sometimes I think Lewis could express himself more clearly. So maybe he didn't mean this way, but the way he expressed in this chapter, I think he would say that we would all have to vote to allow gambling in the state of Maryland, because your Christian morality may say gambling is wrong, it's not a good stewardship and it's irresponsible, but not everybody feels that way because not everybody's Christian, so we shouldn't force our views upon them. And I just don't think it's that simple. I don't think it's that simple in my mind. So, all right, moving on to forgiveness. The next chapter he's talking about forgiveness. And this is one of the harder parts for a lot of Christians to really wrap their minds around about what exactly this is required of us here. And Lewis, I think, hits a nail on the head about one reason anyway, why it's so difficult for us to understand what our duty to forgive really entails and what it includes. And I really like the way he breaks this down. And what he says is, understand that in Christian morals, thy neighbor includes thy enemy. And so we come up against this terrible duty, and terrible, what he's speaking of here is in our own minds, difficult in that sense. Not that it's a bad thing, but it's a very difficult thing that we're going to have trouble accepting. This terrible duty of forgiving our enemies. Christianity, point blank, allows you or requires you to forgive your enemies. And then this next quote is really powerful if you remember the context. All right. Lewis was writing this in the 1940s. Great Britain is just coming out of World War II. And so there was a lot of anger, obviously, a lot of hostility for what had transpired in World War II. And what he says is this. He says, everyone says forgiveness is a lovely idea until they have something to forgive, as we had during the war. And then to mention the subject at all is to be greeted with howls of anger. It is not that people think this too high and difficult a virtue. It is that they think it is hateful and contemptible. I wonder how you'd feel about forgiving the Gestapo if you were a Pole or a Jew, is his quote. And of course, he goes on to say, you know what, I do too. I wonder if I would be able to forgive in that circumstance as well. And so what he's saying here is forgiveness, when we're called to forgive our enemies, I mean, that includes far more, and to love our enemies includes far more than just somebody that cut us off in traffic. All right. It includes some of the most egregious acts that are committed against us, which begs the question of what does that mean? What does it mean to love your enemy? What does it mean to forgive your enemy? Well, he starts off by, of course, talking about the Lord's Prayer. And he says this, he says, forgive us our sins as we forgive those that sin against us. There is no slightest suggestion that we are offered forgiveness on any other terms. It is made perfectly clear that if we do not forgive, we shall not be forgiven. So this raises our next question for the evening. I mean, I'm not going to tip my hand too much other than to say I don't necessarily agree with Lewis that that's the one and only interpretation of these words. But what he's basically saying here is that in order to be forgiven, there is a catch, there's a caveat. You have to forgive. And if you don't forgive, then God's not going to forgive you. All right. If you fall down and you don't forgive somebody, you hold on to that bitterness in your heart, then you're not going to be forgiven of your sins. And so my next question to throw out there to everybody is this one at the bottom of the screen. What is the relationship between God forgiving us and us forgiving others? Anybody want to chime in on what you think? And I will say this is one that different Christian denominations are going to answer potentially differently. So this is a deep thought one. In other words, we know that we're supposed to forgive, and we know that God forgives us. Do you agree? I guess is a good way of putting it. Do you agree with Lewis here when he says that us, if you look at the order of those things and what comes first, that us forgiving others is what comes first. We have to forgive others, and then after that, as a result of that, God turns around and forgives us. This is one of those tough questions. We say it all every Sunday in worship. And it's really good to reflect sometimes on what exactly this means. Lindsay Lesner says, Jesus taught us that in the Lord's Prayer, Jesus taught us that in the Lord's Prayer, so that it is what God wants. But he is a loving God, so I think he wants us to try. I agree with you there, Lindsay. He wants us to try to forgive people. So I guess the question is, according to what, again, this could just be Lewis being a little sloppy in his wording, but according to what he seems to be saying here, let's say that you fail in some case, that you have some bitterness that you're holding on to in your heart. Does that mean that God's not going to forgive you your sins at all? And Thomas Scott says, when you are unforgiving, you have taken God's place. Ooh, good one. When we get to the chapter on pride, put a pin in that one. Remember that thought, because we're going to talk about pride a little bit later tonight, and that's going to play right into that. Barb Gordon says, do love and forgiveness go together? You can forgive but not love someone afterwards. That's an interesting way of looking at it, Barb. And when we get to what Lewis has to say here, it might just be a different way of kind of the way he's approaching it, a different way of wording the same thing that he's trying to say here. But I will tell you that the issue that I personally have, of course, with this is that I think this has it backwards. All right, that God, it's remember what we're saying here is we don't earn our salvation. We don't earn our forgiveness. It's that we don't get salvation from God because of anything that we've done. It's not like if I forgive enough people, then I get saved. All right. God gives us the free gift, grace. And that's the way we are saved. We're saved through, by grace through faith. Not by works, so that no one can boast. We're going to come to that passage again a little bit later on. And so forgiveness of others is absolutely something we should be doing, but it's something that we are, shall we say, capable of doing because God has forgiven us. It's the response to the forgiveness that God first gave us. It's not the cause. It's not something we do to earn God's forgiveness. And we'll see that a few times throughout these things tonight. Lewis kind of goes back and forth. I was having a conversation with Pastor Jay about this a couple of weeks ago, where he asked me about some of Lewis's theology. I think I mentioned it briefly in an earlier class. And the problem with Lewis sometimes, if you really try to pin him down on kind of who initiates salvation, the us or God, who takes the first step, in other words, he kind of gets wishy-washy sometimes. But then again, he says he's not a theologian, so he doesn't really claim to get that deeply into these types of questions. Lauren M. says, when we truly grasp the magnitude of forgiveness and grace we are offered by God, and the extent he went to cover all of our sin, it can make it easier to extend forgiveness to others. Exactly. And that's, Lauren, that's what I'm talking about, is that us forgiving others is the response to God having first forgiven us. Thomas Scott says, if you're willing to forgive, you ask the Spirit to help you forgive as he forgives. Yeah, exactly, there too. But you'll notice what you're saying there is you ask the Holy Spirit to help you. Well, if God hasn't already forgiven you and you're not already saved and you don't have that relationship with God, you ain't going to be asking the Holy Spirit anything. All right. So again, that gets to it's after God has taken his action that we are then capable of doing that. So, all right. And because we're Lutheran here, if anybody's watching and you're not, well, bear with me for a minute, because we are. Luther in his small catechism actually addresses this portion of the Lord's Prayer. And here's what he has to say about it. He says, what does this mean? We pray in this petition that our Father in heaven would not look at our sins or deny our prayer because of them. We are neither worthy of the things for which we pray, nor have we deserved them. But we ask that he would give them all to us by grace. For we daily sin much and surely deserve nothing but punishment. So we too will sincerely forgive and gladly do good to those who sin against us. All right. So what Luther is saying here is, you think about the Lord's Prayer, we're making several petitions to God. We're asking God for our daily bread, things like that. And what he's saying is, look, if you were to look at, how you've lived your life and the number of times you've sinned, guess what? You don't deserve any of that. If God were to decide whether or not on your merits alone he should be granting your request, the answer would be no. All right. And so he's saying what this petition is doing is we're asking God to kind of, through his grace, to give us these things anyway, even though we're understanding that we're not deserving of them. And as a result of the fact that he has forgiven us and we're asking for his grace and he shows us his grace, we are also inspired to go out and forgive others, because how can you not? If you really appreciate what God has done for you and forgiving you, then how can you not be willing to go out and forgive others if that's what God wants you to do? All right. Now, moving on to specifically how you forgive and what exactly it means to love your enemy. This is where we get to the part of the chapter that I really like. And he says, I think there are two things we can do to make this whole thing of forgiveness easier and forgiving our enemies easier. He says the first thing is, if we really want, but it depends on really wanting, to learn how to forgive, perhaps we had better start with something easier than the Gestapo. And that gets into, lots of times when people launch objections against Christianity, they always want to start with the most extreme example. Same thing here. People want to challenge whether or not we really should be forgiving people. They're always going to start with the most extreme example, where it's the hardest thing to do is to forgive someone who's done something so horribly evil. And so what Lewis is saying, let's not start there. Let's start somewhere smaller. Let's start with that person who cut us off in traffic, okay, for example. And he says, and secondly, we might try to understand exactly what loving your neighbor as yourself means. How exactly do I love myself? And this is where I think we get really profound from Lewis in the rest of this chapter, because we're told to love your neighbor as you love yourself. And we know that loving your neighbor includes loving your enemies. Well, that begs the question, how do we love ourselves? And so first he asks a series of questions. He kind of breaks it down, kind of analyzing or comparing how we love ourselves and then extrapolating that to what that would mean for how we are supposed to love our neighbor. And the first thing he asks is this: does love your neighbor mean having good feelings for them? Maybe not the big fluttery early romance feelings we were talking about before, but the same principle. Does it mean actually feeling something inside, something good for that person on that person's behalf? And what he says is this, again, comparing it to the command to love them as you love yourself. He says, I have not exactly got a feeling of fondness or affection for myself, and I do not even always enjoy my own society. So apparently, love your neighbor does not mean feel fond of him or find him attractive. Are there times when we are all sorely disappointed in ourselves? all right, and that we are very upset and we don't really have good feelings about something we did, some way we acted, things like that. Sure, there are. And so what he's saying, well, apparently then, if I'm supposed to love my neighbor as I love myself, and I don't always have good feelings inside my heart about something I did, then that must mean that love your neighbor doesn't necessarily mean having those good feelings and trying to force myself to have good feelings for them. All right, the next question he asks, does love your neighbor mean thinking they are nice? So we moved from these feelings I'm feeling in my heart to these thoughts I'm thinking in my head, all right? Does it mean thinking they're a nice person? And he says, do I think well of myself? Think myself a nice chap? Well, I am afraid that I sometimes do, and those are no doubt my worst moments, but that is not why I love myself. And he expands here, he says, I think myself good sometimes because I love myself. I don't love myself because I think myself good. And he also mentions that, look, there's sometimes I don't think myself particularly good. All right. That I think that I've done something wrong. So just like in our heart, sometimes we feel bad about the things we do. In our head, sometimes we feel bad about the things we do, or we think badly about the things we've done. And he says, so loving my enemies does not apparently mean thinking them nice either. All right. And then he goes on to the third question. Does love your neighbor mean you cannot hate what they do? And he says, in my most clear-sighted moments, not only do I not think myself a nice man, but I know that I am a very nasty one. I can look at some of the things I have done with horror and loathing. So apparently, I am allowed to loathe and hate some of the things my enemies do. That's something that's kind of common to Christianity, isn't it? I mean, regardless of denomination, one fundamental belief of Christianity is that we're all sinners, and we all recognize that we're sinners. Now, how we come to that recognition is a matter of a difference of opinion, but we all recognize that we're sinners, that we've all messed up. Even Paul said, what I want to do, I do not do, and what I hate, I do. So even Paul recognized that there are things he's done that he absolutely hates. All right. Well, if Paul can hate some of the things that he does, then we also are perfectly allowed to hate some of the things that we ourselves do, which then brings us back to, wait a minute, if we're supposed to love our neighbor as we love ourselves, that means that I can love them while still hating the evil acts that someone may have done. All right. And this is where he gets into that famous line that says, can we love the sinner but hate the sin? He says, for a long time, I used to think this is a silly straw splitting distinction. How could you hate what a man did and not hate the man? But years later, it occurred to me that there was one man to whom I had been doing this all my life, namely myself. And that, I love that quote. I love that quote because it really does make us reflective. You think about the way, you love your neighbor as yourself. How do you love yourself? I love myself, even though I still know that I'm messing up left and right, even though I know I've sinned and I've disappointed those that I love, at times throughout my life. And so if I can still love myself, even though I've done those things, then I can love my neighbor, even though they've done those things. I can love my enemy, even though they've done those things. Lisa Brown here says, love is not necessarily meant to be a noun feeling, but a verb to take care of. Doesn't matter if you like them. Exactly. And Lewis extrapolates on that even more. About it's not those fluttery feelings. You ever tried to force yourself to feel a certain thing? I mean, if you think about it, we can, lots of times people, and we'll get more into this in a little bit, lots of times people try to expose themselves to various different external stimuli in order to prompt a certain emotional reaction, emotional response. And extreme examples, of course, would be drug addiction, things like that. But you can also have just going to a music concert in order to get the blood flow and things like that. And so what we try to do is we try to force ourselves to have these feelings. But when that external stimulus is gone, the feeling eventually is going to fade away as well, because you can't will yourself to feel a certain way. And so you can't just sit there one day and say, oh, okay, I think I'm going to, all of a sudden my heart is going to feel like nice fluttery feelings about this person that did this horrible thing to me. And so when we're talking about loving our enemies, it can't be that. It can't be a feeling. It's got to be, like Lisa says here, it's an action. It's a verb. It's something that you do. All right. So then, taking all that into account, what is forgiveness? What does it mean to love your enemy? And what Lewis says is this, is Christianity does not want us to reduce by one atom the hatred we feel for cruelty and treachery. We ought to hate them, but it does want us to hate them in the same way in which we hate things in ourselves, being sorry that the man should have done such things, and hoping, if it is in any way possible, that somehow, sometime, somewhere, he can be cured and made human again. That's what forgiveness means, according to Lewis, in this chapter. All right. One more drink here. Let's move on to the next one, where he talks about the great sin. And he names it. He had this big buildup at the beginning of this chapter. He read it until he finally gets to it, but he finally gets to the point. He says this. He says, according to Christian teachers, the essential vice, the utmost evil is pride. Pride leads to every other vice. And then here we get this really powerful quote. It is the complete anti-God state of mind. And so the next question I want to throw out there is, in what way is pride the complete anti-God state of mind? How is pride so diametrically opposed to God? What do you think? I keep getting notifications on this computer about Facebook or something. I don't know. Not related to this class. Here we go. Barb Gorton says it's selfishness. Yeah, Barb, it is selfishness. And how does that relate to God specifically? In other words, what is selfishness, and how does that impact our relationship with God? Lindsay Lessner says Jesus was the example of humility, the opposite of pride. Yeah, he certainly was. And I guess I'll challenge you to take that one step further. How so? How was it that you describe Jesus as the example of humility? How did he example humility? How did he show humility? Anyone else? If you're exhibiting selfishness, let me ask you this way, which I agree with Barb, pride is ultimately selfish. If you're exhibiting selfishness, who are you putting first? Lindsay Lessner is a servant to others. Yeah, Jesus was a servant to others. He put the others before himself, didn't he? But what is selfishness? Selfishness is putting yourself first, right? Well, here's a softball question of the day that everyone should be able to answer. Who are you supposed to put first in your life? Who should have top priority in your life? Barb Gordon says, if everything in your life is about you, you aren't capable of loving, doing for others, etc. I agree. So who are you supposed to put God. Who are you supposed to put first in your life?
God first.
God first, right? We're supposed to have God first. And so pride is the ultimate, like Barb says here, it's the ultimate selfishness. It's putting yourself first. And if you're building yourself up, if you're putting yourself first and you're building yourself up, then how are you going to have a relationship with God where you put God first? And I'm glad to see other people getting here too. Barb Gordon and Lauren M. both said God. Yeah, God is who we're supposed to put first in our life. Pride is putting yourself first. And so that's going to directly interfere with the proper relationship with God, which is why Lewis calls this the ultimate anti-God state of mind, because the state of mind is I'm first, where the state of God should be humility before God. All right.
I think you're putting yourself on the same level of God. So you're playing God, which is then eliminating the real God.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, that's what we see that even more when Lewis builds on this, and he talks about pride being competitive. He says pride is essentially competitive. It is competitive by its very nature. While the other vices are competitive only, so to speak, by accident, pride gets no pleasure out of having something, only out of having more of it than the next man. It is the comparison that makes you proud, the pleasure of being above the rest. So you're right, Gene. I mean, it is making yourself God, because if pride by its nature is competitive and you always want to have more than everybody else, that means you want more than God. Does this sound familiar to anyone who's read, oh, I don't know, the book of Genesis? Okay, I mean, this should sound really, really familiar, shouldn't it? Bill Rearick here says you become the God of your life, rejecting the real God. Or maybe that's Tony, I don't know, because I happen to know that Bill and Tony are both watching on the same, they're watching together. So I don't know who actually commented that came from, but I will give you both credit for it so I don't get the wrong one. But yeah, you become the God of your life, rejecting the real God, which is exactly what happened in Genesis, isn't it? All right, that's the temptation. That's why pride is the ultimate anti-God state of mind. All right. The other question I want to ask you all is to reflect on this, where if pride is inherently competitive, if the whole point of this the great sin, as he calls it, of pride, is having more of something than someone else, then why are we in a modern American culture, I would say, a particular risk for being influenced by that sin? What is it about modern American culture, do you think, that actually, or maybe you disagree with me, maybe you don't think it does this, and speak up there too. How does modern American culture encourage pride? Bill, just for the record, Bill Rearick does comment that last thought that I was giving credit to both of them on was Bill's idea. All right, good. It was Bill. Give Bill all the credit. How does our modern American culture put us at high risk for giving into the sin of pride? What do you think?
It's a very selfish culture we're living in right now. It's all about me and forget about everybody else.
Yeah, I think we see that even more so as our society seems to become more and more divided. We see a lot of selfishness going around. They're all about me, me, me. Lisa Brown says the same thing. It's all about me. And it's Thomas Scott says we value competitive activities. We certainly do that as well, even in our entertainment. I think a lot of what we see in our American culture, I don't think we even realize how much it's encouraging this kind of pride that Lewis is talking about here. You talk about, you ever heard the phrase keeping up with the Joneses? That's a very common one in our culture. So you want to get more money so that you can have more than your neighbor does. If you see your neighbor has this great new sports car, then you've got to get an even better one. And we're told that that's the goal that we should be striving for. Barb Gorton says, everything seems to say more, more, more. Thomas Scott says, and we reward the winners with entitlements. Yeah. A lot about our culture encourages that type of competitive nature. Lauren M says, even when people do good, it is to look good. Yeah, and it's all about celebrity status and all this kind of thing. And I got to tell you, and this is people don't. I know people that are particularly influenced by our culture. Liz Gordon says, I just said that. Yeah. Bill Rearick says everybody gets a trophy. For those of you that know my backstory, I spent 21 years as an attorney. And let's see, Lisa Brown says, while American individualism can be good, it has a downside, selfish pride. And Lindsay Lenzer says, advertising promotes it. Yeah, absolutely. And and Lisa, what you just hit on there is kind of the reason I'm raising this and kind of emphasizing, zeroing in on this point, is because I'm not saying American culture is bad overall. I'm not speaking against capitalism or anything like that. I'm saying is that we need to understand the benefits and the risks, and you need to be aware of the risks so you can protect yourself against them. Absolutely. Anyway, my personal story, what I was saying was that I spent 21 years as a lawyer, and I was not happy as an attorney. I was not. I was pretty darn miserable about it. And I was blessed this past February to have the opportunity to come work for Trinity, the church and the school, full time. Wear a lot of different hats, but it's funny to me how, especially now with the coronavirus thing going on, I am working, believe it or not, even more hours than I did as an attorney right now, working constantly just at the moment. Get paid a lot less. Newsflash, for anybody that didn't know this, you don't get paid as much working for a church as you do as an attorney. I don't know if that's shocking news to anyone, but in case it is, I thought I'd break you of that illusion right now. So, working even longer hours than I was as an attorney, getting paid less than I was as an attorney. And guess what? I'm immensely happier than I was. And so this whole idea that we have in our culture that you have to have more than the next person in order to actually be happy is a false one. Take my word for it. And it's false if you think about it this way, because there's always somebody who's got more, right? And so we're in this never-ending struggle, this never-ending battle. You're never satisfied, because no matter what you achieve, there's always something more, somebody who's got more than you out there. That, okay, now I've got to get more than that person. Now I've got to get more than that person. And so your entire life is a struggle, and you never actually achieve contentment in any way, shape, or form. So, all right, moving on before I start crying. All right, so another thing that, and understand this, I love this quote too that Lewis says, because it shows that even in our religious ministries, we're not immune to this. All right, religious leaders are not immune to the sin of pride. He says, whenever we find that our religious life is making us feel that we are good, above all, that we are better than someone else, I think we may be sure that we are being acted on, not by God, but by the devil. And I want to give an example. And I went back and forth on, drop my pen cap. Let's see, Barb Gorton says, we are happy you aren't a lawyer, but our go-to guy. Thank you, Barb. And I'm very happy to be here. I want to give an example, and I hope it's okay. I went back and forth about whether to give this example about this, because it's a very positive. There's a particular person. You ever have people in your lives that just, you look back on your life and they really influence you. And there's one person who, if I were to talk about someone who is in religious ministry, who's in Christian ministry, that I every time I look at this person, I'm like, wow, that person exemplifies what it means to what Lewis is getting at here as far as humility and having the right mindset. And not thinking that they're better than anyone else in the ministry. The reason I hesitated to mention this example, because this particular individual, I don't know if he's watching tonight, but I know he has watched some of these classes. And so if you are, Pastor Chuck, it's you. And I want to let you know that how much you've meant to me as a role model, as an example, is that when I think about people in religious leadership modeling the type of humility of, it's not about me, it's about God, and understanding that is a risk when you're up there and you're the leader of the church, so to speak, that a lot of people fall into that sin where they make it about them, and you never did. And if anybody attends Trinity, you've seen this, I guarantee. Sometimes Pastor Chuck's sermons are amazing lots of times. And lots of times he likes to end with a fire and brimstone, right? And he'll come out and he'll just be like, big and emphatic, and he'll make sure you know exactly what his point's supposed to be. And talk about creating an emotional response, right? And then lots of times what happens in that congregation, we are so caught up by what he said, and we are so touched profoundly by what he has said and motivated by what he has said, the natural response is to do what? It's to applaud, isn't it? And the applause isn't supposed to be, yay, Pastor Chuck, you're so wonderful. It's supposed to be, what you just said. Yes, we affirm that. We agree with that. That's fantastic. That's amazing. Anybody ever notice how Pastor Chuck responds when the congregation does that? He always shakes his head. He kind of waves his hand, no, stop. He tries to hurry up and get to the prayer so that, he'll shut people up and stop them from doing that. Hey, Pastor Chuck, if you're watching, I can't speak for everybody, but I noticed, and little things like that, you might not think it's a big deal, but little things like that do influence people who are out there watching. And so that's an example of somebody that in my life anyway, that has strongly influenced and modeled, I think, what Lewis is saying here about, yes, there's a risk even in our religious lives and our religious leadership of giving into the sin of pride. And we have to be cautious against it. That it's not about us, it's about God. So, moving on, before I cry about that one, we're going to, Lewis goes on in this chapter to talk about 4 possible misunderstandings that he wants to clear up about pride before he ends this chapter. And what he says is, the first one he says is, pleasure in being praised is not pride. All right. For here, the pleasure lies not in what you are, but in the fact that you have pleased someone you wanted and rightly wanted to please. All right. So when when a parent walks up to a child and tells them they did a good job on X, Y, or Z, and that child takes pleasure in being praised, that child isn't sinning. Okay. That's not pride, the pride of sin that he's talking about. Because in there, the reaction is not that, oh, yay, look at me, I'm so wonderful. It's being pleased that you pleased your parent, or whoever it was that you wanted to please and rightly wanted to please. And so that's not pride. That's not the sin of pride that Lewis is talking about here. The second example he gives that he wants to clarify is, we say in English that a man is proud of his son or his father or his school or regiment. And it may be asked whether pride in this sense is a sin. Very often in such sentences, it means has a warm-hearted admiration for. That is not a sin, but it might perhaps mean that the person in question gives himself airs on the ground of his distinguished father, or because he belongs to a famous regiment. That is sin. And so when we talk about, having pride in something or pride in someone, what Lewis is saying, whether or not that's this great sin of pride really depends on what you mean by that. If you just mean that that you have you admire that, you admire whatever they did, that's not sin. All right. Yes, we use the word pride, but that's not the sin of pride. If, however, you're puffing yourself up because, hey, look what a great family I belong to, then yeah, that is pride. So it just depends on what you mean by that. The third misunderstanding he wants to clear up is that we must not think pride is something God forbids because he is offended at it, or that humility is something he demands as due to his own dignity, as if God himself was proud. He wants you to know him, wants to give you himself. And he and you are two things of such a kind that if you really get into any kind of touch with him, you will in fact be humble. In other words, if you really understand who God is and who we are, how can you not be humble? So humility actually strengthens our relationship with God. That's the point. God isn't overly all high in himself, so that's why he wants us to be humble. He's not committing this sin and then telling us not to sin it, to do it. In other words, the point is he wants to have a deeper relationship with you. And like it or not, God is infinite. You are finite. So you expressing humility and understanding humility is one way of deepening your relationship with him. And that's what he wants. All right. That's the ultimate goal in all of this. And the fourth misunderstanding that Lewis wants to clear up, it says, do not imagine that if you meet a really humble man, he will be what most people call humble nowadays. He will not be a sort of greasy, smarmy person who is always telling you that, of course, he is nobody. Probably all you will think about him is that he seemed a cheerful, intelligent chap who took a real interest in what you said to him. He will not be thinking about humility. He will not be thinking about himself at all. In other words, a truly humble person is not someone who's going around saying, oh, look how pathetic I am all the time, right? A truly humble person is someone who's just thinking about others. And so that's when you meet someone that they're genuinely interested in you and they're listening to you. They're not trying to dominate the conversation with everything about them. That's a truly humble person, all right? All right, moving on to charity. All right. What is charity? Christian charity. Charity, according to Lewis, means love in the Christian sense. But love in the Christian sense does not mean an emotion. It is a state not of the feelings, but of the will. The state of the will which we have naturally about ourselves and must learn to have about other people. And he goes on to clarify. Though natural liking, so what he means by this is we all have some people we like, some people we don't like. All right, so there's natural feelings of liking someone. Though natural likings should normally be encouraged, we should be encouraged to try to like other people. It would be quite wrong to think that the way to become charitable is to sit trying to manufacture affectionate feelings. The rule for all of us is perfectly simple. Do not waste time bothering whether you, quote unquote, love your neighbor. Act as if you did. When you are behaving as if you loved someone, you will presently come to love him. All right. Again, this gets back to what we were saying before. You're not going to be able to just make yourself feel something differently about someone just by the pure matter of wanting to feel that way, or saying, I really should, feel like I like this person more than I really do. But what you do is if you start acting that way, then you're going to start feeling and having more understanding and more empathy for them. If anybody has seen this movie or read this book that's on the screen right now, that was kind of the theme of this. This was, gosh, I think I looked it up the other day. It was 2008. This is 12 years old now, believe it or not. Yeah, that's making me feel older. But this book, Liz is nodding her head. Yep. Fireproof was a book from the Well, it was a movie from the Kendrick brothers about marriage, and basically about this couple that were getting ready to split up, and it's this dad passed on to his son this book called The Love Dare, which is a 40-day challenge. And essentially what the premise was, each day he had to do something for his wife to act, things that would act like he loved her. All right. And understand, at the beginning of this journey, he certainly did not feel that way. He was very, very angry. But through taking these steps, through taking these journey of these actions, then it did in fact bring him closer together with his wife. And eventually, the feelings did surface. That's very similar to what Lewis is saying here that Christian charity is. If you sit around and wait until you feel like being charitable to someone, and guess what? You're not going to be charitable to them. What you need to do is you forget about how you're feeling about them. Go out and be charitable to them. And then you're going to eventually start to generate those feelings. Lisa Brown says, feelings need to follow actions or there will be no actions. Wow, Lisa, I didn't even see that when I just said that, by the way. Lisa and I we're like connected here, right? That's exactly what I just said. Yeah, you're right. Absolutely. You're never going to do it. You're never going to step out and take those actions if you're waiting to have those feelings first. And Lewis goes on to say, the worldly man, meaning non-Christians, treats certain people kindly because he likes them. The Christian, trying to treat everyone kindly, finds himself liking more and more people as he goes on, including people he could not even have imagined himself liking at the beginning. And I think this is something that we should take into mind when we're looking at our congregations, the church worldwide. Congregations should not need to be comprised of everybody who's exactly like you, or like me, or like whoever, right? If we're truly a good charitable Christian congregation and we're in this together, then we should be comprised of people from multiple backgrounds, multiple interests, things like that. Even if it's someone that, let's take the classic example of the junior high lunchroom. All right, now they don't let them choose their seats anymore, but when I was growing up, when we would go into the lunchroom, everybody would get to pick where they sat. And of course, you had certain groups that would always sit together. All right, certain cliques, so to speak, that would always sit together. That's not what a Christian congregation should be like. All right. And if you're having trouble because there's certain people that maybe you wouldn't choose, they're in your congregation that you wouldn't choose to sit with, if this were that junior high lunchroom, guess what you should do? Be charitable towards them. Follow Lewis's advice. All right. And that's going to make stronger congregation in the end. And then he goes on to say, feelings are not what God principally cares about. Christian love, either towards God or towards man, is an affair of the will. And this is also where we get into that balancing act that I was talking about before. That's all true. We've just got to be careful that we have the right mindset. We're not doing charity. We're not being charitable to others in order to try to win God's favor. All right. God first loved us, and then in response to him showing the love to us, now we are in return showing love to others. We don't show charity to other people to thinking, well, if I do enough charitable acts, then I'll earn my way into heaven. I'll earn my way into God's favor. That's just something we need to be careful about, that we're doing it for the right reasons. All right. All right. The next virtue that Lewis talks about, he talks about charity, and now he moves on to hope. Now, in this chapter, what's really cool, and now I'm going to put my apologist hat back on, whether intentionally or unintentionally, Lewis actually presents one of the lesser known arguments, apologetic arguments for the existence of God in this chapter, and it's what's called the argument from desire. First, what I want to do is I want to walk you through what Lewis says, and then I'll kind of show you how that all fits into an argument for God. Here's what he says. He says, most people, if they had really learned to look into their own hearts, would know that they do want, and want acutely, something that cannot be had in this world. There are all sorts of things in this world that offer to give it to you, but they never quite keep their promise. And here's the point he's trying to make. There is a void, sometimes referred to as a hole in our heart, so to speak, or something to that effect, that we all feel, and we all try to fill it with something. Now, if anybody here is, let's just say, my age, you may remember a song from 1990 by, they weren't one-hit wonders, they were like two-hit wonders. They were definitely one-album wonders. It was a group called Extreme. And they were more famous for their song More Than Words, this love ballad, More Than Words they did. But in 1990, they had another song, it was called Wholehearted. And wholehearted was spelled H-O-L-E, like a hole in their heart. And it's funny because a lot of people look back at the lyrics of this song. It was a really upbeat song, cool guitars, really neat song, but they're not Christian artists. They weren't Christian per se. I will say in the music video for Wholehearted, the lead singer is wearing a cross on his necklace. Who knows what that means? You know, lots of times people just wear that as jewelry, but whatever it was there. But listen to the lyrics of this song. They say this. They say, life's ambition occupy my time. Priorities confuse the mind. Happiness one step behind. The inner peace I've yet to find. Rivers flow into the sea, yet even the sea is not so full of me. If I'm not blind, why can't I see that a circle can't fit where a square should be? There's a hole in my heart that can only be filled by you. And this hole in my heart can't be filled with the things I do. This heart of stone is where I hide. These feet of clay keep warm inside. Day by day, less satisfied, not fade away before I die. And then it repeats the fact that there's a hole in my heart that can only be filled by you. You know, at the time that song came out, I think a lot of people thought it was some kind of a love ballad where someone was trying to sing to their romantic partner. You look back on those lyrics, I look back at them as an adult and I say, I don't know if it was. That certainly looks like what Lewis is talking about here, that someone's coming to the recognition that there's a hole in their heart that can only be filled by God. So what Lewis is saying for starting things off with is that we all have this void. There's something that we're longing for, all right? And because we're getting short on time, I'm gonna kind of push us through here. We only got about 13 minutes left. The question here I have at the bottom of the page is, what kind of things do people try to use in order to fill this hole other than God? And what is the problem when people try to fill it with those things? And those of you that are, if somebody wants to chime in here on Zoom or on YouTube, please feel free. I'm just gonna keep going if nobody here speaks, so as not to have that 20 to 30 second delay. But I do want people to feel free to chime in here. But kind of what I'm getting at with this question is, if you think about it, there's something that people are looking for. And there's lots of things, like Lewis says, there's lots of things in this world that promise to be able to fill it. Some people fill it with drugs, some people try to fill it with sex, some people try to fill it with money. And yet what they always find is whatever they try to fill it with, it always looks appealing. At the outset, it always looks like it's going to be able to fill that void. But in practice, it never does. It never does. You always end up still having that feeling and then looking for something more. And the classic example, of course, is drug addiction, where you feel this emptiness, this hole, and you resort to artificially fill it with drugs. Well, what happens is you take the drugs and then they wear off, and of course you go through withdrawal or whatever, and you never feel the hole is never finally and fully filled. And so what do? You go out and try to get more drugs to try to fill it again, and it's a never-ending cycle. We see that very clearly in things like drug addiction, but multiple things in life can follow that same pattern, where we try to use them to fill that hole. And this is what I love about that song Wholehearted. It's like, there's a hole in my heart that can only be filled by you. Why? There's another great line. There's a circle can't fit where a square should be. We're trying to put square pegs or circle pegs in a square hole, so to speak. And it can't be filled, that hole can't be filled by anything that we do. All right. So that's the starting point for this argument for reason that actually points toward God. Lewis goes on to say that when people are trying to fill this hole, there are two wrong ways to fill it that he points out, and one right way to fill it. And the first one he calls the fool's way. And the fool puts blame on the things themselves. He goes on all his life thinking that if he only tried another woman or went for a more expensive holiday or whatever it is, then this time he really would catch the mysterious something we are all after. Well, I mean, the question I have at the bottom of the page there is, what will be the result of trying to fill the hole this way? And that's kind of what I was just talking about. Are you ever going to fill the hole? Are you ever going to fill it? I mean, no, right? Eventually, whatever you're trying to fill it with, you're going to need more, and you're going to need more, and you're going to need more, and you're always going to convince yourself that, oh, I just did this one thing wrong last time, but this next time it's really going to work. All right, and so you end up in this never-ending struggle to try to repeatedly, continuously fill the hole. The second wrong way that Lewis mentions is the way of the disillusioned, quote unquote, sensible man. Keep in mind, he doesn't really think this man is sensible. He's putting that in quotes because it's what society might think this person is being sensible, or this person might think they're sensible. There is a fox outside my window. I'm sorry, I just thought I'd share that. I looked out my window and there was a red fox walking down my my sidewalk. So there you go. I hope my dogs are inside. Anyway, so the way of the sensible man, he soon decides that the whole thing was moonshine. Of course, he says, one feels that way when one's young. But by the time you get to my age, you've given up chasing the rainbow's end. And of course, the danger here is it's just giving up, isn't it? I mean, what if God really is out there? What if there really is something, of course, which we as Christians say there is? What if there really is something to fill that hole? Then you're just lying to yourself. Lying to yourself doesn't answer the question. And certainly lying to yourself isn't going to fill that hole. You're still going to feel it. It's still something that's innate in all of us. And so just denying it and trying to act like it isn't really there, doesn't really exist, there really is no way to filling that hole, well, you're really missing out in the end where you could actually get it filled. And then the third way that he says, which is the right way, the Christian way, he says, the Christian says creatures are not born with desires unless satisfaction for those desires exists. A baby feels hunger. Well, there is such a thing as food. A duckling wants to swim. Well, there is such a thing as water. Men feel sexual desire. Well, there is such a thing as sex. If I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. All right. The key to understanding what Lewis is getting at here is in the phrase, he talks about that there are certain desires that we are born with. All right. And those are the desires he's talking about. We all have desires that we develop, throughout our lives as a result of culture or family or friends or whatever. And those types of things, there might not actually be something out there that can satisfy them. To make it even clearer, there's a theologian by the name of Peter Kreeft who kind of tries to differentiate these two types of desires by calling one natural desires, excuse me, and the other one artificial desires. The difference between them is this. A natural desire is a desire that stems from within ourselves. These are the type of desires that are innate to what it means to be human. For example, we all have desires for food, drink, shelter, friendship, things like that. That's part of what it means to be human, all right? An artificial desire, however, is something that stems from outside of ourselves. So these are the kind of things that our culture or our upbringing instills in us. Things like a desire to get more money, a desire for a better job, a desire to have the latest fashions, to have a better car than your neighbor, things like that, all right? Those are artificial desires. The argument from reason says that all natural desires have something that actually exists that is capable of satisfying them. Not necessarily the artificial desires, but all the natural desires, if you look at them all, food, shelter, things like this, there is something that is capable in existence of satisfying those desires. It does not mean that everybody has equal access to those things, but there is something that is at least capable of satisfying them. Now, according to this argument, this desire that we all feel, this hole in our heart, so the desire for something to fill that hole is a natural desire. That's not something that's culturally instilled in us because we see it everywhere. All right, we see it across the world, across time. So it's not an artificial desire. So if that's true, if it's a natural desire, that's part of what it means to be human, and every other natural desire has something that can fulfill it, then there must be something that exists that is capable of fulfilling it. And Peter Kreeft breaks it down like this. He says, every natural innate desire in us corresponds to some real object that can satisfy that desire. Number two, but there exists in us a desire which nothing in time, nothing on earth, no creature can satisfy. And conclusion, therefore, there must exist something more than time, earth, and creatures which can satisfy this desire. This something is what people call God and life with God forever. All right. So if we all have this natural desire for something to fill this hole in our heart that we all feel, and if every natural desire has something out there that exists that is capable of filling it, and the only thing that's capable of filling this hole we have in our heart is something transcendent, something like God, then God must exist. That's basically, in layman's term, how the argument goes, and what Lewis is saying here in this chapter about hope, and that's why we have hope. That's where our hope comes from. All right. We've only got 4 minutes left. We'll see what we can get through here. Probably not everything. We can pick up where we left off next week if we need to. But Lewis closes this book with 2 chapters on faith. And this is where we get a little touchy, because he does say that he's doing mere Christianity. But I do think at times in these last 2 chapters, he kind of steps outside the bounds of mere Christianity. He certainly gets confusing on it a little bit. But there are some overall themes, broad themes that he says in here that are absolutely dead on. And the way he kind of structures these 2 chapters is he says that overall there are 2 ways in which Christians use the term faith. The first way, he says, the first sense, it means simply belief, accepting or regarding as true the doctrines of Christianity. But what does puzzle people, and what Lewis said used to puzzle him, is that Christians regard faith in this sense as a virtue. What is there moral or immoral about believing or not believing a set of statements? And he goes on to explain this. I was assuming that if the human mind once accepts a thing as true, it will automatically go on regarding it as true until some real reason for reconsidering it turns up. In fact, I was assuming that the human mind is completely ruled by reason, but that is not so. The battle is between faith and reason on one side and emotion and imagination on the other. All right, so what Lewis is saying here, and I agree with his general point, he's saying that we can be influenced by emotion, right? And lots of times, even though something logically may make perfect sense, and if we were really just using our reasoning abilities, we would think one way, we let our emotions and what we want to be true get in the way and override that. And so we automatically believe what we want to be true, not necessarily what we reasonably should believe to be true. But here's the problem, I guess. And the question I ask is, does he step out of mere Christianity here? Because not all Christians would agree with him that faith is considered a virtue in the way he describes it. Remember, what he's describing here is faith in the sense of just believing something to be true. And what he says is, well, even if I believed that Christianity was true to begin with, I could be influenced by my emotions down the line. And through my actions alone, basically, I could, through my efforts, I could hold on to that faith. I could resist these temptations of the emotion. All right. And so the question that I ask when I read this chapter is how, the question here is, how is it that Christians who hold to their faith overcome that influence of their emotions? All right. Certainly, if we do hold on to our faith in God throughout our entire lifetime, then we haven't given in to this tendency to let our emotions and our imagination run wild and take us away from that. But why? Why haven't we given in to that? Is it because we did it all through our will and our practice and our fortitude? Or is it because God did it for us? Who initiated it, in other words? And here's the problem. Lewis almost makes it sound in this chapter like even if God gives us our faith initially, it's our efforts through resisting these influences of the imagination and emotions that allow us to hold on to our faith. But look at Ephesians chapter 2, verses 8 and 9. This is what we talked about at the beginning of the class. And I'll throw this question out there and then we'll kind of end the class on this. So please feel free to answer this on YouTube. If it says, for it is by grace you have been saved through faith. And this is not from yourselves, it is the gift of God, not by works, so that no one can boast. And we may disagree on this, but I look at that and I wonder, well, Mr. Lewis, if God gave us faith to begin with, but then the only reason we're able to hold on to it throughout our life is because of our efforts, wouldn't we at the end of our life be able to, I don't know what the word is for this, boast and say, hey, look, I'm better than those people who didn't hold on to their faith because I, through my effort, through my fortitude, I was able to resist all of this. All right. I don't know. What do you think? Throw your thoughts on YouTube or chime in. Maybe I'm wrong on this, but I don't think we can say that holding on to our faith once God gives it to us is the result of our individual effort, as if God had nothing to do with it, because that would give us right to boast, wouldn't it? That would give us something that we accomplished, that we did, that has to do with our salvation. Thomas Scott here says, I like how Anne Graham Lotz defines the differences, and there's a colon there, so I think there's probably more coming here. I'm not sure if differences between, we're still talking about what we were talking about before or now. So I'll wait a second to let you finish typing if there's more of that as far as the differences between what. But anybody else want to chime in on that as far as what do you think is, if we were able to hold on to our faith and resist temptation throughout our life solely as a result of our effort, would that give us something to boast about? Going once. Oh, here, Thomas Scott says, belief is the consent of the mind. Faith is the choice of the will. Trust is the commitment of the will. Phyllis says that. I keep saying Thomas Scott, but yes, you guys are probably watching together there too, aren't you, Phyllis? Belief is the consent of the mind. Faith is the choice of the will. Trust is the commitment of the will. I think the issue that Lewis might have here, and this could just be some of his not being precise, is where's God in this? I mean, I guess I'd be more satisfied with this if I saw where God was in all of this, continuing to hold on to our faith. And I just don't see it anywhere in his explanation about how he feels about that. All right, we are actually almost done. So here's what I'm gonna do. I'm gonna try and pump through it like in the next 5 minutes. Thomas Scott or probably Phyllis again says commitment of the heart. Yeah. If you can stay with us, great. If you can't, I understand. You can, this is on YouTube. You always come back and watch it later, but I'm going to try to get through the rest of this faith discussion really quickly here. So we're not further behind than we were before. Lauren M says, he who endures to the end will be saved, but it's the Holy Spirit that helps us endure. Yeah, Lauren, and do you see that in that explanation from Lewis? That's what I see missing. That's what I don't see in this chapter. And that's what bothers me is what's the Holy Spirit's, what do you think, C.S. Lewis? What's the Holy Spirit's role in allowing us to endure to the end? I don't see that. It almost seems like it's focused solely on us. Tom and then Thomas or Phyllis Scott, all is a gift from God. Yeah. And he goes on, and I'll kind of, you can look at this one, and we won't go too much into this. This is kind of more the same thing, where Lewis goes on to say that God has been waiting for us to realize that we cannot keep his law and that everything we have is given to us by him. When a man has made these two discoveries, God can really get to work. And that line kind of bothered me a little bit too, because like, really, so God can't do anything with us until we of our own power come to those realizations? Couldn't God be the one who's responsible for us coming to those realizations? So anyway, and then, so Lewis does encourage Christians to engage in daily prayer, to engage in daily scripture reading. And I agree with him on that. Obviously, we should be engaging in those disciplines. I think we just have a difference of opinion for the rationale of why we do those things. I mean, he says you engage, you do the daily prayer and the scripture readings to help you through your efforts persevere until the end. And I think that leaves God out of the picture too much. In my mind, we do those things because we love God. And if you love God, wouldn't you want to get to know more about him? If you truly appreciate what he did for you in sending Christ and dying on the cross, wouldn't you want to please him? All right. And so it's a response. We certainly should do those things. If we truly appreciate what God has done for us, we're going to naturally want to do those things. And in the second sense, he talks about faith. He says it is the change from the other way. So one way of thinking about faith is just belief in something, believing a set of propositions. Then he goes on to what I really think is the thrust of the matter. He still gets confusing every now and then, but this is really the thrust of the matter. He says it is the change from being confident about our own efforts to the state in which we despair of doing anything for ourselves and leave it to God. The sense in which a Christian leaves it to God is that he puts all his trust in Christ. I know some of you asked me to send you these slides ahead of time. If you got them and if you're referring to them and looking at them, you should underline, circle, draw arrows to that word trust a million ways to Sunday, okay? That's the key word. And I give this analogy. That there on your screen is a much skinnier me and my son, James. This is when he was about 4 years old, and he is now about to turn 13. Matter of fact, on Friday is his birthday. He will be turning 13 years old in 2 days. I can't believe it. I'm going to have 2 teenagers in my house. But I have the picture when he was 4, not just because he's absolutely adorable, and I look better too, but to give an example, I often give to explain faith in this sense and what it means, all right? When my son was young, one of his favorite tricks to do was he would stand on the stairs about 4 or 5 steps up, and when I was in front of the stairs, my back would be turned on him, right? And all of a sudden I would just hear out of the blue, "Daddy!" I turn around and there's my son already in midair, arms stretched wide, jumping toward me. All right. Now, I never dropped him, thankfully. All right. Now he has done this over and over and over again. And guess what? I'd always caught him before. All right. So how do we describe what his attitude toward me was when he did that? Well, he had faith in me, didn't he? He had faith that I would catch him. It wasn't foolish, blind faith. He had something to go on. I'd give him something to go on because I'd caught him every time in the past, but he trusted me. All right. So when we talk about having faith in this second sense Lewis is talking about, it's about having faith in God, about having faith in Christ's sacrifice for us. It's trust. God's given you enough. He's not giving you everything. You can't understand everything, but he's given you enough to know that he can be trusted and that you can take that jump off the steps. All right. You can trust in him. All right. So that's the second sense. Now, the last few slides, we won't go over all of these per se. I mean, those of you that have, if you want them, there's only 4 slides left. You can shoot me an email if you don't already have them. Be happy to send them to you. It's just really some more nitpicky stuff that I have with the way Lewis has kind of phrased things here, where he kind of goes back and forth when it comes to our salvation. How does it initiate? Is salvation initiated because we all on our own, of our own power, make a free choice to accept God, and then God starts working on us? Or is it that God gives us faith? All right. And even that realization that we're falling short, that in and of itself is a gift from God that we would never have come to on our own. I fall into the latter camp, FYI. But Lewis kind of is wishy-washy, and he says things that could be interpreted either way. And so that's all the last slides are. If you want them, shoot me an email. But the main point of these last 2 chapters is understanding those 2 senses of the word faith and how it's used. And really, I would say focus on the second. What we really talk about as far as a saving faith in Christ is that trust factor, is being willing to jump off that step into his open arms. All right. Any other questions about anything this evening? If so, I'd be happy to answer them. We will wait. And what I'm going to do right now, as we're waiting for any final questions, again, you 2 people have to catch up. So I'm just going to look at the people here on Zoom. I mean, you're not visible. You can't be seen by anybody. We'll just have a little conversation. Hey, how you guys doing tonight? Nod your head. You have fun tonight? It was good? It was good? All right. Yay. Awesome. Great. Yeah, this is I'm feeling this is a very one-sided conversation right now, but that's okay. We're waiting to find out if anybody has any other questions on YouTube. They should be almost caught up by now.
Here, one thing.
What's that?
Forgiveness.
Yes.
I think none of us really are presented with, like, let's say you'd have a child, let's say would get murdered or something, or a loved one. And then to forgive that person that did that is really tough.
Well, and I think that's what Lewis was getting at when he's, and of course, in his time, the example everybody was giving was the Gestapo, right? I mean, that was the culture
Right.
that everybody was saying. So he's saying, when we want to learn to forgive our enemies, let's start lower than that, and then you kind of build yourself up to something that difficult. But I think one thing that can make it easier maybe that's the bad word. That's probably a bad way to putting it. But one way that can help us get there is the realization that forgiveness doesn't mean condoning. It doesn't mean forgetting. It doesn't mean in any way, shape, or form denying that what the evil act that this person did was in fact evil. And it doesn't mean having to generate these touchy-feely feelings for them. It just means forgiving them and loving them in the same way we love ourselves when we fall short. And maybe, you know, we haven't done anything that egregious. Maybe we haven't killed someone, but we've all done things that we realize were wrong. And we're still able to love ourselves, but loving ourselves means looking at ourselves in those moments and saying, you know what? I wish you hadn't done that. That was a wrong thing to do. And I really hope that you do accept Christ if it's somebody who's not a Christian, for example. And I do hope that if there's any way of turning your heart around, that it be turned around, you know. And I'm not, and that allows us to not hold on to that in our own hearts, because I mean, anybody psychologist will tell you that, you know, the longer you hold on to that resentment and everything, it's gonna harm you in the long run.
Right. And I think it would take time. Once you get over the shock of it, then I'm sure your faith would kick in there.
Yeah. So, actually, and it's funny you should bring that one up, because I'm preaching this Friday night at the Friday night worship event, and it's going to be kind of neat, because normally, of course, I'm behind all the equipment, so I'm going to be like helping my wife and run all the tech stuff, and then run around real quick to do the message and then come back around again. But I think I'm going to be picking up on the stuff we've been talking about with forgiveness and loving your neighbor and loving your enemy, what all that means, because I think we're even before this whole coronavirus thing came down, you know, our country was getting very, very divided, and we tended to split ourselves up into, you know, this team versus that team. And there's a lot of hatred. There's a lot of bitterness that goes back and forth. And I think we as Christians need to step it up and model something better. And I think Lewis's insights in that chapter on forgiveness and on what it means to love your enemy can, at least for me, I mean, I don't know, maybe they don't help anybody else, but for me, they help. They really help me put it in perspective. So, all right. Well, I think our YouTubers have had plenty of opportunity to chime in if they want to with any other questions. So, barring anything else, well, first of all, I'm going to stop sharing my screen here so we can get rid of that. And I'm going to thank everybody for joining us this evening. Thank you to our Zoomers. Thank you for our YouTubers. 2 weeks left. And next week is going to be a fun one. We're going to start the final book in the final section of Mere Christianity, where Lewis is talking about laying the groundwork for the doctrine of the Trinity. All right.
And you'll send us the what do you call it? Well, like the slides. You'll send those to us.
Yeah. I've got an email list of everybody who's asked me to send them slides ahead of time so you can follow along.
Great.
Did I send them to you tonight, Jean?
I'm sorry?
Did I send them to you for tonight?
Yeah.
Were you on the list?
Yes, you did. Yes,
right.
I really enjoyed them.
It's really just something. It's a email list that I've already set up in my email account.
Okay. Oh,
so
great.
The same one. So if anybody else wants them, shoot me an email, kcoughlin@trinityjoppa.org. That's KCOUGHLAN @trinityjoppa.org. I'd be happy to add you to the list. So,
thanks, Tim.
All right. Good night, everybody. Thank you for joining us. And
Thank
God
you.
bless.
God bless.